In 1843, an American lawyer named John Lloyd Stevens stood at the edge of a clearing in the Guatemalan jungle, staring at something that shouldn't exist. Pyramids rose from the forest floor, their stones so perfectly fitted that a knife blade couldn't slip between them. Elaborate carvings covered every surface, depicting rulers in ceremonial dress, their hands raised toward celestial bodies, tracked with mathematical precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. But the cities were empty. Utterly, inexplicably empty. The question that has haunted archaeologists ever since is simple and terrifying. Why would millions of people abandon cities at the height of their glory? Why would they walk away from architectural marvels, from temples aligned to celestial events, from irrigation systems that had sustained them for centuries? The answer, as we're about to discover, overturns nearly everything we thought we knew about one of history's greatest civilizations. Because the Maya didn't just disappear, they made a choice. And that choice reveals something profound about the relationship between civilization, environment, and human ambition. The story of the Maya begins not with collapse, but with an achievement so improbable it still seems impossible. Imagine building not just villages, but sprawling metropolises in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The lowland tropical rainforest where the Maya flourished receives torrential rainfall for half the year, then nothing for the other half. No major rivers suitable for irrigation. No obvious water sources during the brutal dry season from January to May. Soil that turns to mud when wet and hardens to concrete when dry. Every ancient civilization we celebrate emerged in places with natural advantages. The Egyptians had the Nile's predictable floods. The Mesopotamians channeled the Tigris and Euphrates. The Romans inherited Mediterranean trade routes. The Maya had none of these advantages. They had jungle, drought, and determination. By 2600 BC, settlements dotted the region that would become their heartland. These weren't crude villages. Archaeological evidence from Cuello in modern Belize shows sophisticated planning, ceramic production, and the foundations of what would become one of history's most advanced mathematical systems. By 1800 BC, they were cultivating maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers. And by 1500 BC, the architectural genius was already evident. But here's what textbooks rarely mention: the Maya were never an empire. This fundamental misunderstanding colors every popular account. Unlike the Aztecs or Inca, the Maya never unified under a single ruler or central authority. Instead, their civilization consisted of dozens of competing city-states, each ruled by a divine king claiming descent from the gods themselves. Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, and dozens more vied for dominance, forming alliances and waging wars with a sophistication that rivaled Renaissance Italy's city-state rivalries. The mathematical achievements alone defy belief. While most of the world struggled with basic arithmetic, Maya mathematicians were working with a vigesimal system, a base 20 numerical notation far more sophisticated than anything in Europe at the time. They independently developed the concept of zero, represented by a shell glyph, centuries before it appeared in India, and more than a millennium before Europe discovered it through Islamic scholars. This wasn't just abstract philosophy. Zero allowed them to perform complex calculations, to track astronomical cycles with breathtaking precision, to predict eclipses decades in advance. Their astronomical observations revealed a culture obsessed with time itself. The Maya calculated the solar year at 365.2420 days. Modern measurements put it at 365.2422 days. They were off by 0.0002 days per year. Let that sink in. Without telescopes, without precision instruments, using only naked eye observations recorded over generations, they achieved accuracy that wouldn't be matched in Europe until after the invention of advanced clocks. They tracked Venus with such precision that they calculated its synodic period at 584 days, accurate to within hours. They knew that after 52 civil years, or 73 ritual years, Venus would return to the same position in the sky. This wasn't casual stargazing. This was systematic, generational scientific observation, recorded in hieroglyphic texts on stone monuments and in bark paper books called codices. The calendar system itself demonstrates intellectual sophistication that challenges our assumptions about ancient peoples. The Tzolk'in, a ritual calendar of 260 days, meshed with the Hab, a civil calendar of 365 days, creating a 52-year cycle. But they also maintain the long count, an absolute timeline measuring from a creation date in August of 3113 BC, allowing them to record and predict events spanning millions of years into past and future. Cities like Tikal eventually encompassed 3,000 separate structures, including temples, palaces, causeways, and massive reservoirs for storing the rainwater that meant survival during the annual drought. The population of the Classic Period Maya region may have reached 2 million people, most concentrated in the lowland regions where water management wasn't just important, but existential. And here's the engineering marvel that gets overlooked. In regions without natural water sources, Maya rulers didn't just organize labor. They solved an impossible equation. They built artificial reservoirs in the ceremonial centers, next to temples and palaces, deliberately concentrating the most vital resource. Control of water during the dry season meant control of population. It meant the power to exact tribute, to command labor, to sustain the astronomical priesthood that predicted planting seasons and celestial events. This water control system wasn't just practical engineering. It was the foundation of royal power itself. The king wasn't merely a political leader. He was the intermediary between mortal and divine realms, specifically identified with the young maize god whose gift sustained life. His ability to provide water during drought proved his divine mandate. When ceremonies and technology later failed to provide sufficient water, the entire institution of kingship crumbled. But the brilliance came with a price written in blood. On the summit of a temple pyramid in the city of Yaxchilan, sometime in the 7th century, a woman named Lady Kabal Suk performed an act that modern sensibilities find nearly incomprehensible. She took a rope studded with obsidian blades and pulled it through a perforation in her tongue. Blood poured down, collected in bark paper, that would later be burned as an offering to the gods. Her husband, King Itzamnaj Balam II, performed his own ritual, piercing his penis with a stingray spine and allowing the blood to flow. This wasn't torture. It wasn't punishment. It was religious devotion at its most profound and disturbing. The Maya believed that blood contained chul, a person's vital life force or soul. More than that, they believed human blood was literally composed of divine blood because the gods had sacrificed parts of their own bodies to create humanity. The theological logic was inescapable. Blood had to be given back to the gods. The debt had to be repaid. And the blood of kings, being closest to the divine, held the most power. Bloodletting wasn't private. These rituals occurred on pyramid summits, on elevated platforms visible to thousands gathered in plazas below. The public spectacle served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the ruler's willingness to suffer for the community. It proved their access to the sacred sphere. It legitimized their political power through theological performance. Elite women participated alongside men, particularly royal consorts who sometimes pulled thorny vines through tongue perforations or used bone awls to pierce ears and cheeks. Archaeological excavations have recovered the tools. Stingray spines with traces of dried blood still clinging to the barbs. Obsidian blades with distinctive wear patterns from cutting human flesh. Bone awls shaped specifically for piercing soft tissue. Hieroglyphic texts describe the rituals in matter-of-fact detail. Stone carvings show rulers mid-ceremony, blood flowing into ornate vessels, the agony visible in their postures. For males in royal lineages, the expectation was even more extreme. Penile bloodletting was the most sacred ritual a king could perform. Using stingray spines or obsidian blades, they would pierce the foreskin or glands, sometimes repeatedly. The pain described in surviving texts as opening doorways to altered consciousness. In this state of agony-induced trance, they claimed to receive visions, to communicate directly with gods and ancestors, to see the unseen forces that govern the cosmos. The bloodletting intensified toward the end of the Classic period. New evidence suggests that, as environmental and political pressures mounted, rulers performed these rituals with increasing desperation. When cities saw their worlds crumbling, when droughts stretched longer than any in living memory, kings and queens frantically tried to communicate with gods who seemed to have turned away. The archaeological record shows a correlation between increased bloodletting inscriptions and periods of documented political stress. But bloodletting was only one part of the sacrificial economy. Human sacrifice, while apparently less common than among later cultures like the Aztecs, was nevertheless integral to Maya religion and politics. The dedication of major building projects required human offerings. The enthronement of new rulers demanded blood. The sacrifice of an enemy king represented the ultimate offering to the gods. In AD 738, something remarkable happened at Quirigua. The vassal king, Kak Tiliu Chan Yopat, captured his overlord, Waxaclajun Uba Kewil of Copan, and ritually decapitated him in a reenactment of the death of the maize god. This wasn't ordinary warfare. This was cosmic drama played out with human lives. The political made sacred through blood. The methods varied. Heart extraction involved laying the victim across a stone altar, while priests used ceremonial flint knives to cut through the ribcage. The heart, still beating, was presented to temple idols. Arrow sacrifice involved binding victims to stakes, painting white targets over their hearts, and shooting them full of arrows while ritual dancers circled. Decapitation sometimes occurred after torture, after scaling or burning. The bodies of particularly brave warriors were sometimes dismembered, with portions eaten by attending nobles in acts of ritual cannibalism, meant to absorb the victim's courage. Modern squeamishness aside, these practices made perfect sense within Maya cosmology. They viewed creation not as a singular event, but as an ongoing process requiring constant renewal. Blood, seen as the ultimate life force, nourished the gods who in turn sustained the cosmic order. Without sacrifice, the sun might not rise, the rains might not come, the maize might not grow. Every ritual killing was an investment in cosmic stability. Yet, even this doesn't capture how wrong we were about Maya warfare. For decades, scholars promoted a comfortable fiction. J. Eric S. Thompson, one of the 20th century's most influential Mayanists, convinced a generation of researchers that Maya cities were essentially vacant ceremonial centers, that the civilization was governed by peaceful astronomer priests conducting abstract mathematical observations. Maya culture was painted as the enlightened counterpoint to bloodthirsty Aztecs. The decipherment of Maya hieroglyphics in the late 20th century shattered this fantasy. The texts revealed wars, brutal and frequent. They described captives, tribute, and destruction. Palace intrigue, assassinations, and political machinations filled the historical record. New archaeological evidence from sites like Witsna shows that violent, destructive warfare targeting civilian populations occurred centuries earlier than previously believed. In 2022, researchers published findings from the bottom of Laguna Eknab that fundamentally challenged our timeline. They found massive charcoal deposits dating to between 690 and 700 AD, evidence of a catastrophic fire that burned the nearby city of Vitsna. The timing was crucial. This occurred during the early Classic period, when warfare was supposedly more ritualized, less destructive. Yet, here was clear evidence of total war, of entire cities deliberately burned, of scorched earth tactics employed long before the Terminal Classic, when environmental pressures supposedly turned neighbors into enemies. The hieroglyphic inscriptions describe conflicts with chilling specificity. The glyph compound translated as Star War appears in contexts suggesting total annihilation. Cities weren't just conquered, they were destroyed. Populations weren't just defeated, they were enslaved or scattered. The warfare wasn't abstract or ritualistic. It was visceral, brutal, and aimed at complete subjugation. City-states competed for control of trade routes, for access to obsidian sources in the highlands, for salt deposits in the northern Yucatan. They fought over water sources, over agricultural land, over prestige and honor. The rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul spanned centuries, with other cities forced to choose sides in a conflict that shaped the entire Maya lowlands. Alliances shifted. Vassal states rebelled. Political marriages attempted to bind enemies together, usually unsuccessfully. By the 6th through 8th centuries, Conflicts in the southwestern region had intensified dramatically. Evidence from texts, art, artifacts, architecture, and site placement all indicate more numerous and more destructive warfare events. The costs were staggering. Mobilizing forces required subsistence support and transport infrastructure. Building fortifications diverted labor from agriculture. Reconstruction after battles consumed resources. Farmers became soldiers. Leaving fields untended, the agricultural base that supported everything began to erode. And then, between 750 and 900 AD, something unprecedented happened. Cities began to empty. Not all at once, not everywhere, but across the southern lowlands, the great ceremonial centers fell silent. Construction projects stopped mid-completion. Stelae went uncarved. Elite tombs became simpler, then vanished entirely. Populations drifted away, abandoning cities that had stood for centuries. For decades, the explanation seemed obvious. Drought. Catastrophic, civilization-ending drought that made the land uninhabitable. The evidence was compelling. Paleoclimate data from lake sediments showed that between 800 and 1000 AD, the Maya region experienced the most severe drought in thousands of years. Annual precipitation decreased between 41 and 54%, with peak drought conditions reaching up to 70% rainfall reduction. Relative humidity dropped by 2 to 7%. For a civilization dependent on seasonal rainfall, this should have been apocalyptic. Researchers analyzed oxygen and hydrogen isotopes trapped in gypsum crystals from Lake Chichen Itza in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. The heavier isotopes indicated severe water evaporation, painting a picture of lakes shrinking, reservoirs drying up, crops failing. The timing seemed to match the archaeological evidence of urban collapse. The conclusion appeared self-evident. The Maya fell victim to climate change they couldn't control. But in November 2025, new research published by the University of California, Santa Barbara, completely overturned this narrative. The study, combining climate records, archaeological data, and sophisticated computational modeling, revealed something nobody anticipated. The abandonment of Maya cities occurred under improving climatic conditions. The researchers were as surprised as anyone. The biggest surprise for me was that the abandonment of cities occurred under improving climatic conditions, said Douglas Kennett, the study's leader. We have long thought that the decline of classic Maya cities partially resulted from an extended period of drought. It turns out to be a much more complicated and interesting story. The new model explains both urban growth and decline through population ecology, rather than simple environmental determinism. Cities grew during periods of climate stress because agricultural intensification required concentrated labor, because defense against raiders required walls and soldiers, because powerful economies of scale made city life advantageous despite the crowding and disease. When drought threatened food supplies, dispersed rural living became untenable. People moved to cities where elite-controlled water systems and intensive agriculture offered survival. But when conditions improved, when rural areas could again support scattered populations, the equation reversed. The costs of urban living, always high, no longer justified the benefits. People could return to autonomous family farming, to less regimented lives, to places where disease spread more slowly and resources weren't controlled by elites extracting tribute. They left cities not because they were forced out by catastrophe, but because better options became available. This doesn't mean drought didn't matter. It mattered enormously. But not in the way we thought. The relationship between climate change and urban dynamics was more complex than drought causes collapse. Drought drove urbanization. Climate improvement drove de-urbanization. The pattern helps explain why agrarian populations, whose land-extensive economy typically incentivizes dispersal, would aggregate in cities despite the high social and economic costs. Warfare played its role, but not the one usually imagined. Violence predated environmental stress by centuries. Political rivalries, competition for trade routes, and status conflicts drove warfare long before drought became severe. When resources became scarce, existing conflicts intensified, but they didn't originate from scarcity. The warfare between city-states contributed to political instability, that made coordinated response to environmental challenges nearly impossible. And then there's the factor that makes this story particularly haunting. The Maya created their own environmental catastrophe. Research on deforestation and local climate change reveals that by the Terminal Classic, tens of millions of people had stripped the landscape of forest to build cities and farms. The widespread deforestation reduced moisture flow from ground to atmosphere, interrupting natural rain cycles. Computer simulations show that localized drying decreased atmospheric moisture by 5 to 15% annually. Even a 10% decrease represents an environmental catastrophe. Combined with natural drought cycles, the situation became dire. The Maya engineered their own downfall through ecological transformation that made their region less habitable. They were victims not just of climate change, but of climate change they themselves induced through land use practices that seemed rational in the short term, but proved devastating over centuries. The collapse wasn't total. Northern Yucatan cities like Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and Mayapan continued to flourish through the post-classic period. These cities had access to cenotes, natural sinkholes providing year-round water, making them less dependent on rainfall and artificial reservoirs. They maintained trade networks, political structures, and cultural continuity. When Spanish conquistadores arrived in the early 16th century, they found thriving Maya communities, though nothing approaching the classic period's glory. And here's the crucial point often missed. Maya civilization didn't end. The people didn't vanish. Descendants of the classic Maya still live throughout Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and Mexico. Over 5 million people speak Mayan languages today. Many communities still use the 260-day Tzolk'in calendar for religious practices. The cultural traditions persisted even as the political structures of divine kingship and monumental city building disappeared. What collapsed wasn't the Maya people, but a specific form of political organization, an ideology of divine rulership, an architectural tradition of pyramid temples and hieroglyphic monuments. The vacuum left by failing water control systems and intensifying warfare created space for alternative social organizations. Smaller communities, more egalitarian structures, settlements near perennial water sources, these became the new normal. The transition was traumatic, but it wasn't extinction. Yet, secondary and minor centers that weren't heavily dependent on centralized water control survived the drought and the collapse of regional powers. Some thrived. The archaeological record shows continuity at many sites, even as nearby major cities fell silent. This selective survival pattern supports the idea that political structures tied to water control were more vulnerable than communities with diversified water sources. The collapse of Maya civilization offers stark lessons for our present moment. Climate change, both natural and human-induced, can destabilize even the most sophisticated societies. Political fragmentation prevents coordinated response to environmental challenges. Short-term rational decisions, like clearing forests for agriculture, can create long-term catastrophes. Elite concentration of vital resources creates dependencies that become liabilities when systems fail. But perhaps the most important lesson is about resilience. The Maya survived, not as monumental city builders, not as divine kings commanding armies of laborers, but as communities maintaining cultural identity through conquest, colonization, and modernization. The knowledge encoded in their calendar system, their agricultural practices, their language traditions, these persisted. Though much was lost, Diego de Landa, a Spanish bishop who arrived in Yucatan in 1549, initially tried to preserve Maya culture through documentation. His Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán remains one of our most important sources on pre-conquest Maya life, but his religious zealotry overcame his scholarly interests. Believing he faced heresy, he burned countless Maya codices, destroying centuries of accumulated knowledge. Only 4 codices survive today. The Dresden, Madrid, Paris, and Grolier codices. Imagine what we lost in those flames. Mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, historical records, medicinal knowledge, philosophical texts. Centuries of accumulated wisdom turned to ash because one man believed he was fighting demons. The cities Stevens and Catherwood documented in the 1840s were already centuries into decay. Vines wrapped around carved stones. Tree roots cracked temple foundations. The jungle had reclaimed what humans built, as it always does. Yet, even now, new discoveries emerge. LiDAR technology allows archaeologists to peer through jungle canopy, revealing cities and road networks nobody knew existed. Each excavation brings new hieroglyphic texts, new insights into Maya political structures, new data on how they manage their environment. We still don't fully understand why populations never returned to rebuild the great southern cities. Throughout human history, valuable real estate rarely stays abandoned, yet the Maya lowland centers remained largely vacant from their collapse until Spanish contact. Something fundamental changed in how people related to place, to political authority, to urban living itself. Was it trauma? Did the memory of collapse, of cities that promised security but delivered only drought and warfare, convince people that concentrated urban living was a trap? Did the ideological framework supporting divine kingship shatter so completely that rebuilding those structures became unthinkable? Or did practical considerations like degraded soils, altered microclimates, and unstable politics make reconstruction simply unviable? We're still piecing it together, still arguing over interpretations, still discovering new sites. And in that ongoing investigation lies the fundamental question: what can the rise and fall of the Maya teach us as we face our own environmental challenges, our own political fragmentations, our own choices about how we organize society? The Maya weren't primitive people who failed. They were sophisticated mathematicians, astronomers, engineers, and artists who faced impossible challenges in an unforgiving environment and built something magnificent anyway. They developed one of the few independent writing systems in human history. They calculated cosmic cycles with stunning precision. They created art of breathtaking beauty. They built cities that still inspire awe 1,000 years after abandonment. And when those cities became untenable, when the costs outweighed the benefits, they made a choice to leave, maybe not consciously, not all at once, but gradually, family by family, generation by generation. They chose autonomy over urban complexity, scattered villages over concentrated cities, a different way of being Maya. That choice echoes across centuries, a reminder that civilizations aren't inevitable, that complexity isn't always beneficial, that sometimes the wisest decision is knowing when to walk away. If you found this deep dive into Maya civilization as fascinating as I did researching it, please hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations of history's greatest mysteries. What other ancient civilizations should we examine? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. And remember, the past isn't just something that happened, it's a mirror reflecting possibilities and warnings for our present and future. Thanks for watching.